They say the Rowan girls simply faded after 1953. No graves, no goodbyes. But when I unearthed their names in the orchard, I knew. This family didn't lose their daughters, they buried them alive in silence. I stepped onto the warped porch of Rowan Manor just as a late morning sun strained through a veil of mist to reveal the house's faded grandeur. Its once bright cream paint now peeling, and stained with years of untold stories. Each small crack like a fractured memory, and when I placed my hand on the heavy front door's tarnished brass knob, I felt the pulse of history ripple through the wood, as though it were waiting for me to return. I exhaled and braced myself, because this house carried a reputation older than my own, a weight measured in daughterless decades and unanswered questions, and the breeze carried a sudden echo of something too soft to name, like a lullaby abandoned in the walls, or a voice too faint to call to, but it made me pause before opening the door, the latch creaking like the cry of a newborn lost in silence. I crossed the threshold and was met by the scent of aged oak and mothballs, a blend that felt like memory pressing into my senses, and the hallway stretched before me with its ghostly stillness, every carpeted step emitting a drain of sound, as if the house itself was absorbing noise, so that something else might slip in unnoticed. My reflection shimmered in the glass of a long-neglected grandfather clock, its hour hand frozen at 3:13, and I wondered what event had interrupted its tick. That precise moment in time purposely halted to honor or conceal something too painful to let tick forward, an echo of the way daughters had halted in this family after the fateful year of 1953. Even the pictures worn along the hall, wedding photos, ancestral portraits, almost seemed to shiver in the hush, their blank eyes trained on me with mixed hunger and reproach, as though I cared a question of those missing girls in my gaze. And with each breath my chest tightened, not from fear, but from a kind of terrible empathy for whatever had happened here, for the ghosts that likely still lingered in corners and doorways, longing to be named. I remembered the rumor, never spoken aloud, but carried from neighbor to neighbor, that the Rowans had ceased having daughters after 1953, that each baby girl born to that line had vanished either in infancy or shortly after, with only the boys surviving, and that the house had grown more silent, more distant with each passing year, as though it mourned not one but a procession of lost lives, and that silence had become thicker than the dust on the floors. I walked deeper into the foyer, past a curved staircase whose banister bore fingerprints from generations of children, girls I would never meet, sisters who may have raced up these steps, laughed in the halls, now eradicated from polite memory, and my fingers traced the banisters worn with a soft, honoring gesture, as though I could coax their presence back into being with that simple touch. Soft light sifted through dusty carpets, illuminating a small table at the corner of the stair landing on which sat a single crocheted blanket, pristine but blank. No doll, no toy, just a white rectangle folded too neatly, an absence in fabric form, and I felt my throat tighten under the weight of anticipation and dread. The stillness was not empty. It pulsed with what was withheld. I had returned to Rowan Manor not as a curious historian, but as someone born of its lineage. My grandmother had been the youngest Rowan daughter, born in 1939, and one of the last to survive beyond infancy, and her own memories of sisters never spoken aloud had been shadowed by denial and sorrow, but she insisted only that something was always wrong with girls in that house. And when I came to research the family archives years ago, I found baby books with erased entries, christening gowns, pulled from drawers with threadbare hope, and photographs of smiling boys in baby carriages. Rows of them, brothers carried in glory, but none of the girls, as though someone had meticulously excised their presence from canvas and memory both. I climbed the stairs, each step raising more of that quiet dread in my mind. The manor felt like a womb that had gone sterile, a cradle that had stopped rocking, and I stopped on the first floor landing, noticing that the hallway's wallpaper motif, once bright lilies of the valley, had been carefully overpainted with a slightly different shade. It seems faintly visible under my flashlight, suggesting someone had tried to scrub out something corrupt in the design, as though even the house had tried to cleanse itself of the stain. But the imprint showed through, stubborn as a memory that won't be buried. I examined the wall for minutes, tracing the seams and dim prints until I felt tears threaten, and it was then I heard it. Not a sound, but an echo, something like a slow breath or the hiss of fabric against floorboard, and I spun, heart pounding, to find only shadows stretching. The afternoon sun slanted through shutters, and everything resumed its mute demeanor, leaving me in the hush again. trembling with the possibility that every disappearing daughter had left a trace, not just in records, but in sound and scent and the very fibers of the house. The staircase split at the landing, one wing leading toward the bedrooms, the other toward the eastern wing where the nursery had once stood. I moved down the bedroom hallway first, past doors with nameplates, Michael, 1948, Robert, 1951, Mary crossed out, and my foot caught on a small wooden plaque where Mary had been slashed twice and left unpainted behind, the letters hanging in a residue of paint that suggested erasure, not absence. I pressed my finger into wood grain and felt splinters loosen beneath my touch, as though the house had been shaped by each deletion, each silencing, each erased name. My chest was heavy as I reached the nursery doorway, an ornate oak door, slightly ajar, its wood swollen with age and secrecy, and I hesitated, remembering my grandmother's one whispered confession. I was the first girl born after them, after 1953, but I still wasn't allowed to stay. I swallowed fear and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was perched on stillness. A single crib, painted white with gold trim, its mattress gone stiff and flat, sheet rotted where I could not see, and wallpaper curling at the corners like decay unraveling the story it was meant to keep alive. Sunlight made dust motes dance in an eerie hush. Toys lay scattered in perfect disarray. A wooden horse missing one wheel, a porcelain doll whose glassy eyes stared up at the ceiling, a music box that had once played a melody now unrecognizable in memory. I knelt by the crib, brushing my fingers over its rim, feeling the cold weight of generations that had never sat here, and the floorboard beneath creaked with my presence, as though even it recognized the inevitable moment of reckoning. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved a small notebook, a child's handwriting in blue ink. I am here. I will stay. It was a message left by a daughter born in 1955, recorded discreetly in family papers, a statement layered with desperation and defiance. I pressed at the crib's railing and allowed tears to fall, tears for daughters erased before they were whispered into the world, for the rhythm of female life extinguished without explanation, and for the truth that lingered. Rowan Manor didn't just house a family. It housed a disease of omission, a systemic fear that girls would break the bloodline's fragile balance. And so they were sacrificed not for demons or curses, but for the ruthless cry of legacy. The gusseted hush of the house deepened, as if waiting for my next breath or my cry of freedom, and I exhaled heavily before standing and stepping back toward the hallway, each step a spasm of grief anchored by determination. I had come to name the daughters, to understand their fate, and to unravel the mosaic of silence placed over motherly love and girlhood in this manor, and this hallway, with its fractured wallpaper and erased names, was just the beginning. And as I passed into the corridor, once more, I realized I carried not just questions but their unspoken pleas, and I wasn't leaving until I had answered for every daughter the Rowans had erased. I woke before dawn to a faint coldness in the air, the house unusually still, as though it were holding its breath. And when I descended the creaking staircase and felt my hand brush against the polished banister that held decades of silent histories, I was struck by a disturbance I couldn't place until I stepped into the upstairs gallery hallway and saw it. The sweep of empty frames, bare plaster, and gilded woodwork where an entire row of portraits had once hung, portraits of Rowan daughters born between 1954 and 1960 whose faces, until yesterday evening, stared down with pale determination from their ornate frames, eyes glinting like silent sentries, and now their absence felt like a wound torn open in the heart of the house. I paused, heart racing, breath caught between dread and disbelief, and placed my palm against the empty wall, with a curling edge of wallpaper peeled at my touch as though recoiling from exposure, wallpaper now stained with dust that formed a faint halo around each empty frame. Prints of images that refused to be erased even when their physical forms were removed, and in that moment I felt the pulse of all the erased daughters, beating in the raw space left behind, a presence insisted upon by absence. And I realized this was no refurbishment or cleaning. This was removal or concealment, deliberate and chilling. And as the first sliver of dawn light gilded the hallway, I crossed the nearest plaque beneath the void, reading the name etched in tarnished brass. And Rowan, 1955 to 1955, and beneath, just a blank line where her portrait should have rested. My breath quivered as I pressed my forehead to the cold plaque, feeling the memory of a mother's stifled cry in the early hours of Anne's disappearance, a sound still resonant in the wood, and I thought then that the silence had grown teeth. It wasn't content to swallow these daughters once. It was demanding they vanish again from memory. I followed a row of empty frames, counting them, 6 in total. Each labeled a daughter who had vanished from record with disastrous precision. Mary Rowan 1956 to 1956, Elizabeth Rowan 1957 to 1957, Rebecca Rowan 1958 to 1958, Charlotte Rowan 1959 to 1959, Dorothy Rowan 1960 to 1960, ending in a final unfinished plaque bearing only a date, 1961, as though someone had paused mid-era, mid-daughter, unable to finish the erasure entirely, leaving a fault line in the family history, and I swallowed, tears gathering. Behind my fragile veil of calm as the impulse to scream or rage surged, but stayed lodged in my throat by the gravity of what this meant. The house no longer wished to even remember the girls it had erased, and it expected me to follow its imperative. I moved away from the hollow wall, footsteps silent on the carpet, and began to inspect adjacent walls, patches of newer paint almost invisible under inspection, seams between paneling that hadn't been caulked correctly, slivers of fresh plaster between picture hooks, and in the dim morning twilight, I thought I could just make out the outlines of faces etched faintly in dust, photos disturbed in vacuum beneath or behind boarded frames. But the subtle evidence was enough to indicate a patient, cleanup, a purge of presence, not space, and I felt my skin tremble with outrage and sorrow. My fingers traced a jagged edge of what had been a hidden seam behind the wallpaper, pulling at a loose fragment and revealing the edge of a frame's dusty foot. I pulled the paper away, exposing the bottom of a gilded frame still embedded in the wall, its nails rusty, offering a history of neglect and quiet preservation at odds with the removal performed overnight. A single housekeeper's intervention, or concerted erasure directed by someone fearing the daughter's stories might find light. I stepped back, awareness widening to encompass the entire gallery, its polished mahogany floors, its high-domed ceiling painted with mythic Rowan history, ancestors lined up from left to right across 2 centuries, and yet here, in the lapse of all that inheritance, there now sat a gap in the lineage, eyes unseen, voices uncalled, and I could no longer pretend that the portraits were gone due to time or shortage. They were gone because someone had decided they must be forgotten. My pulse sharpened into a spike of urgency. I knew I had come too late to prevent their original absence, but I might still bear witness to what the house insisted should be buried once again. I retraced my steps slowly, stopping at each plaque, looking for inconsistencies in the brass notifications. None reflected updates. All looked untouched except for dust-free fingerprints around edges, as though someone had touched each, and I imagined the caretaker's gloved hands wiping glass, unscrewing frames, sliding them into crates, packing them for storage or disposal, an act that felt like necromancy, burying memory in boxes, burying bloodlines in silence. I resolved then to follow the trail. I would locate the actual portraits hidden behind walls or in storage, and I would reclaim them, and not just for decor, but for their stories. I turned away from the gallery and descended a small flight of carved oak stairs that led to the private family wing, a place I hadn't visited since childhood, drawn as I had been to the quiet hush of its corridors. And as I walked, the hush thickened around me, each step echoing in stillness, and in the corner of my vision I saw a wisp of thread, pale blue, a fragment of a daughter's dress, clinging to the baseboard next to a door labeled, Private, Authorized Personnel Only, and I crouched to pick it up. The thread's softness reminded me of a child's hair ribbon, a funeral ribbon, a last memento, and I realized I was already stepping onto sacred ground that had suddenly grown treacherous overnight. My steps took me to the forbidden door. It was swollen with age, but locked with keyholes so small, I doubted anyone in the household still possessed its key. Yet I noted recent marks around the knob. Smudges of dust, small scuffs. Enough to suggest it had been opened recently. Maybe even last night. Maybe by someone wanting to hide what this room contained. And I pressed my palm instinctively against the center of the door, feeling its grain warm under my skin, a fetid warmth of lingering guilt. And I heard a low acoustic rumble at the other side, as though curtains were swaying in a breeze only the walls felt, or as if the house exhaled its own breath, holding in fear. My throat tightened as I realized the house, in removing sight of the voices, might have left other senses alive. Night watches, whispers that slipped through cracks, footsteps ascended from below, subtle but unmissable in the thick hush, and I felt a pull in my chest, not just alarm or dread, but pure empathy for daughters who might still be present behind these walls in memory or object, a dress folded in a closet, a toy tucked in an attic corner, a diary buried in rubble. And I set my jaw. Someone would answer for this. I continued along the corridor, passing a window overlooking the garden where spring reached its first green flush, wildflowers breaking through stone, the only sign of resilience in this manor built on repression, and in the soft light, I thought I saw a movement, a figure turning inside another room. A child, perhaps. No, a portrait. And then it was gone, all smoke and memory. But it shook me back to purpose, reminding me of my task. I must rebuild faces. I must fill gaps. I turned toward the main hallway, fists balled in nervous anticipation, and headed toward the study room, where I hoped to find estate records of the portrait's commissioning and placement. Each step carried more resolve than the last. I would uncover who removed the portraits and why, and I would restore them. I would bring back the daughters whose faces the house now refused to show. That memory gap would no longer be permitted. The realization began not with a scream or a revelation, but with a drawer that wouldn't open. The bottom one in the chest of four, its handle cool and ornate, shaped like a vine crawling toward bloom, stuck fast as though someone behind it refused release. And when I pulled harder, easing my weight back, though it groaned in protest, finally yielding to reveal a neat pile of folded garments. Christening gowns, tiny satin shoes, lace-trimmed bonnets. Yellow with age, but all clearly preserved with care, and at first it seemed a normal keepsake chest, one kept in any ancestral home. But as I spread the clothes across the dusty rug in the upstairs sitting room, I noticed they bore embroidered names, most faded. Lillian, Grace, Annabelle, Harriet, and beside each garment lay matching hair ribbon clips and small muslin sachets that still held the faintest trace of lavender pressed into their cotton for preservation. Names of Rowan girls born before 1953, all carefully preserved in folded reverence, arranged with maternal tenderness. And then the chest ended. The final garment was a baptismal dress with the name Harriet Rowan embroidered in delicate white thread, and after that, nothing. I lifted the satin and lace folds again, searching for the next row, the next child's name, the smallest booties or the faintest frill, but the bottom of the drawer was lined only in dark felt, empty of all fabric or memory beyond that year. I sat back on my heels, chest tight, heart slamming a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, and stared at the emptiness. It wasn't missing collection. It was a termination, abrupt and final, like a cut thread or a sealed tomb, and that's when I noticed a tag sewn into the hem of Harriet's gown. Final order placed 1953 MR in faint pencil. MR, Margaret Rowan, my great-grandmother. Her handwriting was unmistakable. The final order. Not a delay, not a mistake. Final. I stood, dizzy with the weight of realization, and scanned the room, bookshelves full of boys' toys from the 1950s onward. Wooden trains, marbles, baseball gloves, all polished and ordered, but no dolls, no tea sets, no dresses or school shoes that suggested the presence of a girl. In the corner stood a wicker hamper, and I opened with trembling hands, desperate for contradiction. For some sign this was all a mistake. But inside lay only a single knitted blanket in blue, and beneath it, hospital tags. Michael Rowan, James Rowan, Thomas Rowan, Daniel Rowan. No girls. No tags in pink. No small soft dresses once meant to wrap the body of a newborn daughter. I ran my hands through the items, then shoved the lid shut, heart hammering. The room felt like a shrine of male preservation. And yet, the air pulsed with something else, like breath held too long. I made my way to the manor's attic, a room I remembered only vaguely, last visited in my childhood under the supervision of a maid who warned, "Don't go opening trunks you weren't invited to," and I understood now what she had meant. The stairs creaked underfoot, and as I pushed the attic door open, stale air rushed over me, dusty, tinged with mothballs and dried flowers. In the far end stood an armoire so tall it seemed fused with the eaves of the roof itself. Doors cracked slightly as though expecting me. I approached, wary, and opened it. Inside, nothing but shelves. Empty ones. Yet faint outlines remained. Where objects once rested, a dustless shape here, a ringed circle there, a faint stain where fabric had bled into wood. And I saw, all across the shelving, names written in faded chalk on the back panel. Charlotte and Eleanor, Joanna, Lucy. all dated between 1953 and 1962. The names had been there. Their things had been here. But someone had removed them, erased them, not just from memory, not just from photographs, but from fabric, from touch. I staggered back, sat heavily on a storage trunk, and noticed it bore a small brass keyhole. A rush of urgency overtook me. I remembered the drawer key I had found the night before, tucked behind Harriet's portrait frame in forgotten study drawer. I retrieved it and turned it inside the lock. It clicked open. Inside, documents. Yellowing birth certificates, only half filled. A set of baby name lists marked crossed, disapproved. Medical records listing congenital anomalies that were later struck out and overwritten with deemed unviable. And then the final record. Policy reinstated. No female inheritance. Internal. Enforced as of 1953. MR. The date chilled me. The year was right. The note was handwritten and signed again, Margaret Rowan. My great-grandmother had ordered the purge. I pulled out a black leather journal, tucked into the corner of the trunk. Inside, rows of entries written in the same clean cursive. Another girl, born early. Margaret says we mustn't hope. Harriet's cries went quiet last night. Margaret won't speak of it. We removed all garments. Margaret burned the rest. Told us to tell the doctor she never existed. Page after page, each entry quieter, more strained, as though the act of writing grew dangerous. The final entry read, "There's another due in March. Margaret says she'll arrange a home for her if the child survives. Not here. Never here again." That was dated 1962. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. I looked around the attic, once a sanctuary for memory, now hollow and deceitful, and tears stung the corners of my eyes. They hadn't simply lost their daughters. They had hidden them, removed them, silenced them, systematically. And somewhere beneath this horror, girls had lived briefly, heard lullabies in darkness, touched blankets that would be stripped from them before the second night. I descended the attic steps, journal in hand, and made my way to the family library. There, in the genealogy record stored in acid-free sleeves, I confirmed it. Nothing but male names after 1953. Girls omitted, lines left blank. Some entries retroactively changed from female to stillborn. And yet the dates matched birth announcements found in the back pages of Old Town newspapers, cached in the local archive. A daughter born to Margaret and Andrew Rowan. Quickly followed days later by a funeral notice with no cause of death listed, or none at all. I spent the next several hours in growing panic, pulling records, tracing threads, matching christenings to removals, birth records to disappearances. The pattern was too consistent. Daughters had not merely vanished. They had been deliberately stripped from this family's narrative. I sat back in the dusty study chair, gasping softly, and whispered, "Why?" aloud to the walls that had heard it too many times. And the walls offered no answer. Only the hush of a house ashamed of its own lineage. A house built to protect sons and remove daughters. A house that had, since 1953, made no space for a woman to survive. But I had survived, and I was here now, uncovering the rot beneath the roots. I folded the blanket labeled Harriet and placed it over the arm of the chair. I placed the journal beside it. These things would not be hidden again. Tomorrow, I would descend into the archives below the house, the old cellar where grandfather's records were kept, to learn how deep the removal truly went. But tonight, I would remember each name, each girl, each dress never worn beyond that first day, each one gone, not forgotten, not anymore. IT began with the accidental tilt of a bookshelf, an uneven lean I noticed while trailing my fingers across the spines of a dusty collection of 19th century poetry volumes, Shelley, Byron, Dickinson, names that echoed like prayers in a house that had long forgotten the voices of its daughters. And when I tugged lightly at the edge of the shelf to realign it, a puff of air escaped from the gap behind it, and with it came the unmistakable scent of old paper and dried glue, aged ink, and something more intimate, like a pressed flower left too long in a book, faded, delicate, and bitter. And I reached behind the shelf, fingers brushing against a bundle wrapped in muslin and bound with thin velvet ribbon, which broke apart with a soft sigh as if grateful to be unwrapped, revealing dozens of folded papers, each creased by time and layered with dust, but unmistakably letters, written in different hands, with soft loops and urgent slants, most addressed to no one, some bearing the single word mother, and others addressed only to God or to the one who might remember me. And I sat down on a faded window seat, hands trembling, heart pounding, as I unfolded the first, dated June 12, 1954, scrawled in delicate blue ink on lined stationery bearing the Rowan crest, and it began, "I saw the other girl again last night. She smiled from the mirror, but she never speaks. I think she wants me to go where she went." The words blurred under the swell of tears behind my eyes. The sudden intimacy of that voice, a child so young and already suffocating under silence. And I kept reading. Another letter, dated March 2nd, 1955. They say not to speak of Anne, but I remember her hair, how soft it was. I think she left it in my pillow. I hide it there so Margaret won't find it. The handwriting here was shakier, younger, and the name and matched the plaque I had seen in the hallway, one of the vanished portraits. Each letter was a whisper preserved in secrecy, a last tether to identity before that tether was severed. And as I unfolded the next, I felt my hands tremble with urgency. It was written in pencil, faint and smudged, likely by candlelight or under blankets. They told me I was mistaken, that I was never born. But I have fingers. I have toes. I have thoughts. I matter. A sob cracked in my throat. How many girls had written these, and why had none been sent? Or were they never meant to be? The bundle held at least 30 letters, spanning nearly a decade, all marked between 1954 and 1962, most unsigned or initialed only CRMR, but the voices rang clear, daughters pleading to be remembered, to not be reduced to shadows in a house that catalogued sons and obliterated girls. One letter, dated July 19, 1956, was sealed and addressed, "To the future daughter, if she is allowed to live." The ink was heavy with pressure. Each word almost gouged into the paper, and I opened it with trembling fingers. "They say you will not exist, that the house cannot have another daughter. But if you find this, please know we were here. We were alive. We laughed. We learned. We loved things, books, music, sunlight. They took those things. They made our names vanish. But names live in rooms. Names live in the cracks. Say ours. Say mine, Charlotte Rowan." My breath caught. Charlotte Rowan. One of the names from the attic armoire. I stood up, the letters falling around me like autumn leaves in a sudden storm, and paced the room, unable to contain the sob that rose, harsh and sudden, choking my throat with grief and rage. These weren't mere writings. They were evidence. Testament. The last resistance of girls whose only crime was being born with the wrong name in the wrong time to the wrong family. I returned to the bundle, knelt beside the scattered pages, and began carefully sorting them by date, by hand. Some letters were folded into tiny origami hearts. Others had childish doodles in the margins, stick figures beside houses, little sunbeams and birds, stars drawn beside their names. One had a poem. "The attic knows me better than God. The dust holds tighter than hands. If I vanish, look behind the mirror." My blood ran cold. A map, maybe? A clue? My mind reeled. I took that letter and slipped it into my pocket. Another read simply, "They said I was a test, but I failed. They took away my dress." The implication there of punishment, of exile, of systemic erasure, settled on my shoulders like a vice. These weren't tragedies. These were orchestrations. The girls hadn't just vanished. They had been unmade, erased from memory and record with such meticulous cruelty that only their hidden letters bore proof of their reality. I gathered the letters, wrapping them in the muslin again, but this time I tied the ribbon tighter, not to hide them, but to preserve them. They would be read again. Their names would be spoken. And yet I couldn't shake the line from Charlotte's letter. "Say ours." It echoed like an invocation. I whispered, slowly, trembling, "Charlotte Rowan, and Rowan, Harriet Rowan, Eleanor Rowan." The air in the room seemed to shift, lighter, not haunted, but relieved. And in that moment, I felt them, not ghosts, but memories pressed too long into darkness, rising now toward breath. I stood and turned toward the door, and for the first time since entering the manor, I felt the house lean not away from me, but toward me, listening. And I knew then what came next. I would follow the clues and the letters. I would find the room behind the mirror, and I would open whatever door they had been denied. I was no longer here to research. I was here to remember. For them. For every letter never sent. The moment I found the cellar door tucked beneath the staircase, all the air in the hallway shifted. Every picturesque rug, every polished banister began to sag into silence around me, as though Rowan Manor itself recognized that someone was stepping toward the heart of its shame, and I pressed my ear against the panel, hearing nothing but my own blood pounding in my temples. The door, unlabeled except for faintly carved initials, RC for Rowan Cellar, had a keyhole, but no key, and I examined the grain of the oak closely, seeing impressions of fingernails around the escutcheon, as though someone had forced it open many years ago, or held it shut with desperation, not fear, and I closed my eyes, drawing a breath thick with candle smoke and dust, senses heightened, limbs taut. The house was waiting. I braced my shoulder and shoved the door upward. The hinges screamed in resistance, shredding silence like fabric tearing, and I stepped inside as the darkness swallowed me, and the cellar air, damp with mildew and sour fear, clung to my skin. My phone's flashlight beam jittered over stone walls lined with shelves that held nothing familiar, no wine, no preserves, but wooden crates, paper bundles tied with rope, sealed metal boxes and jars covered in grime, each tagged simply with the daughter's first name and the year of her birth. In 1955, Mary 1956, Elizabeth 1957, Charlotte 1959, Dorothy 1960, and more, dozens of daughters I had never met but whose lives, however brief, were logged here in one final ledger of absence. My heart thundered as I stepped over wooden beams and boxes, the floor uneven beneath my feet. I crouched in pride, opened the first crate. Its lid groaned. Inside, tiny dresses folded carefully, lace collars yellowed, satin slippers curled inward, and one open booklet, a handwritten lullaby, pages stained with tears. I pressed a finger to the paper, feeling the imprint of someone's sorrow. I opened another box. You'd think it would be empty, but there was a porcelain doll from the nursery, missing her left arm, her hair still neat, her painted eyes untouched by dust, cradled in straw like a sacrificed keepsake. Below her sat a journal bound in red leather. Charlotte's diary, 1959 to 1960, its pages brittle but full of words. I fumbled it open. They say I'm too loud. They bring me here to hush me. I cry, then they leave me in this room. My fingers trembled as I read and reread the words. I felt Charlotte's fear. I continued opening boxes, each revealing another daughter's life reduced to objects. School reports, pressed flowers, little hairbrushes, pair of socks she'd sketched daisies on, photographs cut out of family albums and torn at the edges, but still carefully preserved in boxes with no clothes, just written records. Small urn labeled Mary Rowan, shredders used after Harriet, wax dolls melted and buried. I pulled away, nausea rising. These were relics of girls arrested, not alive, not dead, but paused between presence and absence. The cellar felt cathedral-like, a mausoleum of possessions, of fragments gathered in service of remembrance or guilt, and I realized this hidden chamber was Rowan Manor's true sanctum, its altar of erasure, baptizing each daughter into oblivion through silence and concealment. I sank to the floor, clutching Charlotte's diary to my chest, sobbing for the violation of girlhood, for innocence cut short, and for the centuries of paternal fear that exalted sons and outlawed daughters. As tears blurred my vision, I saw carved symbols in the wall behind me, hearts pierced with daggers, lilies crossed out, and the initials MR etched repeatedly, Margaret Rowan's mark, a signature of sanctioned disappearance. It was personal. It was policy. It was ritual. I traced one symbol, a slash across a drawn heart, and thought of each mother who had fixed that bullet above her child's coffin. I stood with trembling resolve, pulling every box toward me, unsealing them, stacking them by birth date, the dusty succession of lives. I lined up Charlotte's doll, Anne's hair ribbons, Elizabeth's drawings, Dorothy's school badge, a tribute to daughters who survived only in memory of objects, and I whispered each name aloud, voice echoing around the vault. but nothing answered. Then, behind a shelf, I found a lock trunk. Its latch was complicated. A puzzle lock shaped like a flower. My fingers searched pockets. I had a small brass key that Mrs. Hartley gave me, but it didn't fit. I searched lids and crates until I found a rolled parchment beneath Elizabeth's box, an old family tree, drawn to 1960, with daughters listed, names circled and crossed, and behind it jammed a note, Mother's Key. I realized the key must still exist in the manor, and suddenly I understood that this room wasn't just a cellar. It was a confession, a pit of objects that spoke louder than any portrait ever could. I gathered the letters, fabrics, toys, and placed them atop the trunk. I resolved I would find that key, open the trunk, and broadcast this evidence against lineage, against legacy, against silence. I backed toward the door, upright now with purpose, the weight of objects in my arms, and as I exited into the hallway above, something shifted, a groan of timber, a breath of wind down corridors, the house responding to removal of evidence. And for the first time, I felt Rowan Manor's walls breathe with me. The cellar's door slammed shut behind me. Soft, final. I returned to the light, knowing what I carried would awaken the house, awaken its lineage, awaken history, and that I would not lower the lights again until the daughters found their voice. I found them in the drawing room at dusk, seated opposite each other in high-backed mahogany chairs, flanking a crackling fireplace whose embers glowed like distant, guilt-ridden memories. And I stepped inside, carrying the urn of Mary Rowan's ashes, found in that hidden cellar, wrapped in white linen, embers of her vanishing threaded through its shadows. And when I sat on the low table before them, the heat of the dying fire met my palm and seemed to scorch my intentions into reality, because at that moment words no longer floated. They cut. The mother, Margaret Rowan, her posture brittle like old china, looked up with eyes guarded as though she hadn't expected resistance, only acquiescence, and when she spoke, voice gentle but edged with old. Steele, she said, you shouldn't have brought that here. And I replied, it belongs here, in the circle of our lineage, where it was never placed, never honored, just like those girls. The room contracted then, all air charged with accusation, as the father, Andrew Rowan, leaned forward, his robes of authority folded into the chair, and said quietly, we follow tradition. I responded, tension rising. It wasn't tradition. It was fear. It was control. Daughters vanished under your watch, erased, hidden, burned, buried, and left unspoken for decades like they never mattered. The crackle of embers punctuated the silence that followed. Margaret's eyes drifted down to the urn. We were protecting the estate, the family name. You fractured that at your birth. We couldn't allow the cycle to continue. We couldn't have another daughter vanish publicly. I felt a blast of anger. So you plan a erasure to preserve a reputation? You never loved them. You only preserved the perception. Andrew shook his head, voice steady and sad. We loved them. We mourned them ineffably privately. But the house could not hold their grief. It would collapse under it. Collapse? Or they collapsed. My eyes burned. They ended in hidden chambers, in erased wardrobes, in burned letters, in ceaseless ignorance. You made them unlivable. Margaret's hand twitched. She closed her eyes. Daughters were a liability. We lacked the wealth, the time, the standing to raise them. Better they be born and sent away than ruin the lineage. I echoed softly, sent away, but no destination was named. You broke promise by omission. Andrew swallowed. We followed counsel. Margaret tilted her head. Church advised it. Parish, court, even doctors, advice not used. I pressed on. So everyone conspired to erase girls? That makes it a conspiracy. They met my gaze then, in unspoken confusion. Conspiracy, dolorous tradition, Andrew said. We were taught what families must do, and they listened. I exhaled, forcing my fury to still so I could dig deeper. When you learned that girls, and Elizabeth Dorothy, were strong, mischievous, beautiful, did you never feel pride? Never want them to live? Margaret's shoulders began to tremble. Oh, I wanted them to live, she said, voice cracking. But I couldn't bear the loss of another daughter. She averted her eyes. We buried them in silence. Not on the ground, they lie in memory. I held Mary's urn aloft. Memory, but you locked in darkness. This ash deserves a place in our garden in light. Andrew sighed, as though every breath had become confession. When Margaret held Mary that morning, we both did. We thought it best. Better to say she never existed than the estate be smashed by a procession of funerals of destitution. Fewer claims, debts, peace. Rage burned anew. Peace? You spent every holiday listening to sobbing mothers, consoling but unspeaking. You thought the house would collapse, so you collapsed its bloodline. Silence stretched. Then Margaret flinched and whispered, I was her mother. I remember everything. I hold every lullaby in my chest. I leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. Then say her name. She stared at me, eyes full, then exhaled slowly. Mary Rowan. The utterance felt like a chime. Then I offered the urn to them. Take it, place it on the mantel. Announce her at Christmas. Let her breathe into this house again. Andrew momentarily recoiled, but took the urn, closed his hands around it as though holding humanity itself. We will, he murmured. And there, in that room thick with light and sorrow, the house trembled. Or so I felt its embers shift in the hearth, the first movement since long before the door is sealed with absence. I spoke again, and every other daughter, and Charlotte, Dorothy, Elizabeth, they deserve the same right. Margaret tucked a stray curl behind her ear, trembling. I will. I placed my hand on theirs. Then let this end. They lived, they mattered, they should be remembered. The urn's lid glinted in dying light as Andrew shut his eyes, nodding. It ends here. I drew in a shuddering breath. The mantel clock chimed 6 times. The daughters were named in consequence. The house sighed as I exhaled. Legacy redefined by voice, not silence. The room felt both lighter and impossibly heavy. Grief meeting its reckoning. And I realized then, this was the beginning of their presence, restored by ritual, by naming by firelight. And by meat, IT was inside a cedar chest, tucked deep in the unused west wing of Rowan Manor, a place where light came in fractured through broken shutters, and the floor sagged with decades of neglect. That I discovered what would become the most damning evidence of all, a series of battered composition notebooks, hand-bound with twine and wrapped in worn cloth, embroidered faintly with initials in pink thread, ER-CRAR, names that had become both sacred and taboo within the walls of the manor. And as I carefully unwrapped the bundle and opened the topmost journal, the ink leapt out at me, rushed and jagged, a scrawl driven more by urgency than art. They say we aren't allowed out, not even for school, but and tried. She made it past the orchard before Margaret caught her. I stared at the words, breath tight, heart clenching as the image formed, of a girl no older than 10 fleeing her Sunday shoes through tall grass, the wind tangling her hair, believing maybe, just maybe, she could disappear into the world before it erased her instead. The next line chilled me further. They put her in the blue room for a week. We weren't allowed to speak her name until Easter. The blue room. I recalled it vaguely. Sealed now. Padlocked. Its windows bricked from the outside. I flipped the page. Charlotte tried to mail a letter. We watched her drop it into the box in town. It never reached the outside. The postmaster said it went missing. The entry ended there, but the following page had been scribbled over, then written anew in a calmer hand. Charlotte stopped eating. Said she didn't want to stay in a place that made her unreal. Margaret said she had withdrawn her presence. We buried her dress with her diary. I touched the paper, and it seemed to pulse under my fingertips, a heartbeat of memory, preserved in confession. These weren't just journals. They were resistance manifest in ink and hope. I continued reading, my breath growing shallower. Entries described whispered plans in the attic, nights when sisters held hands beneath quilts and dreamed of trains, cities, mothers who weren't afraid to name their daughters aloud. Plans always intercepted, always punished. One girl's entire entry blacked out with charcoal smears and labeled unspeakable in heavy red pencil. Beneath it was another's plea. Let the next one go. If they're smart, they'll hide the moment they're born. Pretend to be a boy. Bury their voice. Don't let the name stick. The terror in those words filled my throat with ash. Then I came to Eleanor's diary. The oldest, most water-damaged one. Her opening lines were almost too faint to read. I think I was meant to be someone. I think they saw it. That's why they kept me hidden. Margaret said the world would eat me alive. I told her the house was worse. Page after page. She described escape fantasies. Stories she wrote about cities where girls ran bookstores or drove trams or climbed trees without being punished. And slowly her entries shifted from fiction to plotting. Mapping train routes, memorizing names of sympathetic villagers. But one day it all stopped. The next entry read simply, "They found the map." The ink was smeared after that, and in the margin, in smaller handwriting, Margaret's was scribbled. "Removed to prevent disintegration." Disintegration. A daughter who dared imagine herself elsewhere was not just corrected. She was dismantled. I stood from the floor, the journals heavy in my arms, and walked toward the blue room, its lock rusted, its hinges stiff with disuse, and I pried it open with a rusted crowbar I'd found earlier in the cellar. The door creaked back. Inside was a room so still it might have held breath. Faint scratch marks lined the lower half of the far wall. A child's name, half carved into the floorboard. Anne. A music box sat unopened on a shelf. The room was stripped of comfort, of memory. Only punishment lingered. This was where they were kept quiet. I stepped back, stomach heaving, mind racing through every entry in the notebooks. The girls had tried, over and over again, to flee, to speak, to exist. And each time, the system crushed them, not just Margaret, not just Andrew, but the entire village, the legacy of Rowan men, the quiet cooperation of silence. I sat down in the hallway, breath ragged, the notebooks cradled in my lap like children themselves, and swore. They would be heard. These girls who tried to leave didn't fail. They resisted. They carried the spark. And now that spark was in my hands, burning. I would follow into the next room, the next secret, the next name, and light it into fire. I found a ledger in the town registrar's basement, the heavy wooden file cabinet tucked behind locked doors and glass panels marked property of the Rowan estate, and when I requested permission by name, the clerk's hand shook as she retrieved the key, her eyes flickering with apology and fear. The drawer opened with a soft groan, as though decades of deletion resisted exposure, and behind I found 5 slim volumes, each bound and leather stamped with Rowan ledger, birth and death records, 1953 to 1965, and as I carried the books back into the sterile light below the registrar's desk lamp, my heart thudded in my ears, every breath suddenly sacred. The pages within bore rows of names and dates, the dry, clinical entries of births and deaths, life and erasure, and I ran my finger down the list. And Rowan, born March 12, 1955, female, cause of death, stillborn, scribbled in bold red ink next to it. Certificate destroyed by a state order March 15, 1955. I closed my eyes, stunned, and palmed my forehead until darkness floated behind my lids, the words blurring as I tried to reconcile them with the letters, the toys, the attic journals I'd read. I opened the ledger again. Elizabeth Rowan, born May 17, 1957. Female, died May 18, 1957. Cause, natural causes. Next line. Certificate overwritten by stillborn, entry corrected to female stillborn at 3:45 p.m. same day. I stifled a gasp. They changed records to retroactively bury their daughters in bureaucratic misdirection. Each entry had been massaged, edited, excised, rows crossed out, names swapped, ink smudged deliberately, whiteout applied, and once, an entire birth entry for Rebecca Rowan. December 1st, 1958 was replaced with Robert Rowan, as a converting daughter into son would correct the family ledger's imbalance. My stomach churned. I turned pages by hand, scanning. Charlotte Rowan, born September 4th, 1959, female, natural causes, parentheses and faint cross lines, handwritten note in margin, confirmed sonogram, see MR file. A sonogram? They'd retrospectively demanded proof of sex? On a child dead before testing was possible? That meant the ledger was being used not just to declare death, but to make reality itself false. It was a tool of gaslighting at institutional scale. Heart pounding. I flipped to the next volume. Dorothy Rowan, born November 15, 1960, female, no record of death. Entry deleted. No certificate issued. No certificate. That meant no legal trace. No grave, no cremation, no burial. Dorothy had been wiped clean. I thought of Dorothy's doll, her school badge, her diary lost in that attic trunk. And now she was missing from official existence. I staggered, clutching the ledger as though it might slither out of memory. I scribbled notes. Then desk clerk hovered, offering tea, unnecessary comfort, but I dropped it. This violence against identity wasn't distant. It was precise. It was personal. I compared registry notes with town newspaper clippings I'd pulled from archive microfilm. Each birth notice, a daughter born to Margaret and Andrew Rowan, 05/17/1957, matched ledger entries. But death notices, only infant losses. No mention of stillborn, no funeral, no grave dedication. Among other entries, I found Jessamine Rowan, born February 29th, 1964, female, entry rejected, duplicate name, possible error. On the line below, someone had scrawled, adjusted to Jesse Rowan, male, in a different pen. Even the name had to be masculine. I felt bile in my throat. Masculinity used to overwrite femininity. Systemic misogyny validated by ledger. I took photographs of every altered entry. I traced dates. Births every year, always followed by changes or deletions in records. Then there was a stretch, 1963 to 1965. No entries. The firm end. Our ledger industry had come to a halt. No daughters after 1962. No requests for certificates. No need to falsify. The rows of blank pages stared back. I realized stillborn never had memorials. No headstone. No baby's breath. No family photo. Just a bureaucracy that ensured no name remained. I slammed the ledger shut, heart raw, tears burning. I walked upstairs to feel the sun through the registrar's small window. I loaded photos of the ledger onto a flash drive and made multiple copies. I knew then the ledger was both anchor and weapon. Anchor to place daughters in time, weapon to expose the depth of the erasure. I parked at the registrar's front door as dusk fell, unresolved, knowing this ledger voyage had not just exposed death. It exposed a war on girlhood sanctioned by law and lineage. But I also felt a fragile calm, because once written, the ledger could be made public. Guests could be made aware. Names could re-enter public record. The ledger could say, this girl, Charlotte, Dorothy, Rebecca, once lived. And then it would be impossible to hide again. I sat in my car for a long moment, the key in my hand trembling, face flooded with knowledge. The Rowan legacy of daughter erasure lived in law, in record, in public registry. It could be undone in the same place. And tonight, those names would be re-registered. I found Mrs. Eleanor Graves sitting on her porch at dusk, the shrinking day draping the world in violet sorrow as cicadas hummed from the hedgerows, and when I stepped onto the creaking wooden steps, her eyes flickered up with surprise, the kind of surprise that had lived with her a long time, then settled into cautious recognition as she murmured, "You're the one bringing them back." I sank into the swing beside her, and the boards beneath groaned in greeting, echoing something in my chest I couldn't name. I tucked the ledger photos, journal excerpts, and harp-like fragment of lullabies I'd recovered into my coat, my voice tight but steady as I said, "Mrs. Graves, you lived next door in 1955, 1957. All those years. You must have heard something." Her gaze turned distant, as though listening to children's breathing just beyond her sight, and she drew in a slow breath before responding, words soft but cut to me like fine steel. "Yes, I heard them." I waited, the evening breeze lifting loose hair from her lined face as she continued. "Late at night, down that road, Rowan Lane, I'd be up pacing laundry or reading, and I'd hear singing." She paused, and I held my breath. Not hymns, not lullabies, their own songs. Children singing in the dark. My heart pounded. "Daughters." She nodded, coded voice trembling. Often two voices, soft and overlapping, like twin hearts steering toward each other across silence. I thought it was wind in the wires until I realized it, until I sat on the porch and heard them slip from room to room, right over my house. I swallowed, picturing phantom melodies drifting over hedges. She closed her eyes. I'd open my windows to hear more, but every time I did, it cut off. The song would just stop. No echo, no trace. And I'd feel them, like they were gone again. I leaned forward, pressing her memory with tenderness. Why didn't you tell anyone? Her gaze sharpened, misted. I did once, she said. I told the police. They said I was imagining, that the Rowans kept late hours with music lessons and company guests. And doctors told me it was probably PTSD, nerves, so I stopped going. Her voice cracked, but I couldn't stop listening. I felt tears threaten. And you heard it again recently? She nodded, tears glistening. The night you brought those papers here. I heard them. Silence descended between us, a visceral affirmation that something impossible remained, something human and unbroken. I exhaled slowly and said, I brought evidence. Names, records, toys, journals. They existed. Her hand found mine. They lived, she whispered. Don't let the singing stop. I sat back, feeling the homes behind us breathe. Eleanor's house, the Rowan manor looming dark across the road, and realized that this witness, one with no blood ties or Rowans, had carried the secret longer than any relative, and held the only remembrance that was not in ink or urns, but in music, alive, ephemeral, impossible to erase. I rose then, shaking, and she clasped my hand. Speak for them, she urged. Let their songs finish. I nodded, chest raw as I felt before, and stepped down the porch steps, pausing to look back. The sky was deep indigo now, and as I turned toward the manor, I felt a heartbeat in the darkness, not in the house, but beyond it. I sensed the rhythm of voices suspended between rooms. I heard the hush of future lullabies that demanded release, and in that moment, I understood clarity. I was no longer the only one listening. Mrs. Graves had heard them, and her witness made their absence impossible. Their legacy would not vanish again. The songs would be sung loud. IT began with the ivy, its slow, compulsive crawl up the side of the greenhouse, too green for a yard that had not been watered in months, and its leaves almost waxy in perfection, swaying unnaturally on windless days like they were responding to something beneath rather than above. And as I stepped across the moss-laced path one early morning, boots sinking slightly into earth too soft for July, I knew this was not an ordinary garden. The glass panes above me, aged, but unbroken, filtered sunlight into a bruised golden hue, casting shadows that tremble over the dirt beds. And among the climbing roses and hanging ferns, I saw something I couldn't unsee, a cluster of child-sized footprints etched into the soil, as if someone had walked barefoot beneath the vines. Recently, impossibly, and I followed them with growing dread to a flower bed choked with lilies and nightshade, their roots curling in strange coils around metal tags that bore names, and Charlotte, Dorothy, each label half buried in mulch, deliberately weathered, but not beyond recognition, and I knelt there, brushing aside the petals, my fingers trembling as they caught on something firm just beneath the surface, a corner of parchment, then cloth, then bone, not skeletal, not human, small relics, purposefully arranged, hair ribbons, a porcelain hand, a pacifier sealed in wax, each relic bundled in linen that had been pressed and folded with care before being packed into the earth, as though the greenhouse itself had been seeded not with life, but with silence. I began digging, hands raw from clawing through roots and loam, uncovering 6 distinct bundles laid out in a star pattern beneath the central palm tree, whose trunk grew unnaturally twisted, bark gray and gnarled like knuckles clenched in grief. Each bundle had been buried like a message rather than a body. No bodies, I realized, only memory objects, curated and curated again like a ritual, like an offering, and at the center of it all was a locked box, made of tarnished brass and sealed with a crest I recognized from Margaret Rowan's monogram journals, her private archive symbol. I sat back on my heels, breath shuddering, heart rattling like wind to the panes above. I had discovered a family's second vault, not one of documents, but of ritualized forgetting, a burial site designed not to hold corpses, but to erase girlhood as a botanical process, absorb into leaves, vines, and blooms until the daughter's absence fed the family facade of order and symmetry. I retrieved the box and, unable to open it with force, carried it inside the manor, scrubbing soil from my palms, pacing the study where I'd left the other letters, photos, and evidence. I remember the small gold key tucked into Charlotte's doll's hollow arm, a place I'd initially ignored. And when I placed it in the lock, the brass clicked softly. Inside the box, a letter. On top, one phrase etched in red ink. This must not leave the garden. I unfolded the pages. Handwritten in Margaret's precise, looping cursive, the same hand that had written the birth rejection orders, the ledger notes, the revised death entries, and it began, "We could not kill them, so we implanted them. You must understand, a daughter unallowed is not an evil, but a balance. The soil remembers. The house requires symmetry." My breath caught in horror. It continued. Each girl was gifted to the root, each relic blessed and buried. In the vines they rise again. That is how the song survives, through bloom, not name. I could not believe the monstrosity of her logic, that memory was enough to absolve murder, or that metaphor could replace a life. But I kept reading. The letter listed names, dates, artifacts. It confirmed the daughters were ritually absolved in this garden. A lie to quiet legacy, a system she created, believed in, and ultimately used to convince herself she had protected the family. I dropped the pages, hands shaking. This wasn't just erasure, it was perversion, a maternal logic twisted into self-sanctified ritual. I returned to the greenhouse and stood among the vines again, this time hearing a faint rustle overhead, as if something acknowledged I had read her truth. I looked up. The ivy was still, but I no longer felt alone. I whispered the daughters' names aloud. Anne, Charlotte, Dorothy, Elizabeth, Eleanor. The leaves did not stir, but I felt it, the shift in the air, as though the plants themselves remembered. I knew then what I had to do. I would dismantle the greenhouse. I would exhume each artifact, each name, each memory grown beneath the soil. I would show the world that the house had not forgotten its daughters. It had used them, fed off their silence. That legacy would end here, not beneath vines, not under glass, but in truth. Sunlight broke through clouds above then, casting harsh white light across the flower bed, and the footprints faded slowly into nothing. But I had seen them. I had followed them. And now I would walk where they could not. The confession began late into the night, above the sealed cellar I had unlocked for evidence, when I found a hidden compartment behind a loose plank in the library floor, dusty, carved with runes intertwined with the Rowan crest, and within, a brittle scroll bound in lambskin and ribbon the color of dried blood, bearing in elegant script the title packed to the Rowan line, 1753. And with trembling hands I unrolled it, discovering that it was no mere family. But a covenant signed by the earliest Rowan patriarchs, men sworn to protect the estate's continuity, its reputation, and above all, its control over inheritance through blood and gender, and the language within was stark. Daughters, born into line, would never reach maturity under Rowan stewardship unless they were guarded, guided, and if needed, gathered into the root. A euphemism, of course, for vanishing, disappearance as devotion. The document described ceremonies. The planting of female artifacts in a greenhouse, the naming of daughters on tree bark rather than birth certificates, and even the whispered rites performed at first dawn over an infant's cradle, rites that included the presence of a child's letter or shawl to mark her entry, but whose removal marked her exit. The scroll claimed that by properly executing these rituals, patrician obfuscation, maternal removal, clerical assumption, botanical burial, the family would live in balance and brightness, free of scandal, free of shame. And I realized, with my breath stuck in my throat, that this pact had founded the very system that had erased my sisters, and Charlotte, Dorothy, Elizabeth, Eleanor, pact daughters, not family, and I saw in my mind the layers of compliance that followed. Margaret's journals, the ledger overwrites, the greenhouse artifacts, the cellar relics, all bound by this document. I sank to my knees and read on, finding signatures. Robert Rowan, born in 1720. Thomas Rowan, born in 1745, each generation appending a ribbon of descent or slight deviation, but never revocation, until at the end, a blank seal dated 1901 and signed. The ink blot suggested a break, a refusal, a moment when someone, perhaps the first mother of the 20th century, refused to continue the ritual fully, and I sensed her resistance bleed into every later generation that quietly faltered. I folded the scroll, carried it upstairs to the drawing room where the parents had pledged memory, and spread it across the coffee table. Next to Mary's urn, Mrs. Graves' testimony, the ledger prints, the greenhouse letter. Margaret and Andrew Rowan were roused again, summoned by fate or force, and I watched as Margaret's face paled when she saw the scroll open to her great-grandfather's signature. Tears filled her eyes, but in them I saw both recognition and betrayal. I looked into Andrew's eyes, once strong and smug, now hollowed by realization, and said, voice steady but heavy, this ends you. I explained how every element, garden, ledger, cellar, stemmed from this singular covenant of eradication, and how that sacred oath had bound mothers, fathers, doctors, clergy, and townspeople into a system of erasure that depended on secrecy and ritual compliance. The house, I said, thrummed with the reverberation of its own complicity. Our pact had made daughters into liabilities, our privilege enforced silence. But it need not remain so. I waited in silence as Margaret closed her eyes, chin trembling. When she spoke, voice low, it was not denial but rupture. I never saw it as a covenant. I saw it as protection. I leaned in, but a covenant chooses word over would-be lives. It gives licensing promissory lethal. She wept, not defiance now, but grief. Andrew nodded, voice broken. We, my grandparents, believed the same, that one would die before we found balance. It was not choice, it was prophecy. I leaned across the scroll. But prophecies can be broken. History can be rewritten. I pulled from my coat the flash drive with ledger records, letters, photos, and held it between us. This is not just evidence. This is accountability. This is resurrection. I watched as Andrew reached for the urn of Mary Rowan and placed it gently, this time not on the mantle, but on the center of the unrolled scroll, sealing it with presence rather than blood. Margaret unbolted tearful tears into her hands. Yes, she whispered. Break it. I nodded, voice raw. We'll publish the scroll. Gift it to the Historical Society. Expose the covenant. Priest and prefect will denounce it. Every relic unearthed. Every ledger corrected. Every daughter's name returned to record. She closed her eyes. Do it. In that silence, the drawing room seemed to breathe, walls shimmering with relief as though at last the pact's weight had lifted. I watched them slip from that room, age and love fractured but honesty intact, leaving me to guide the covenant's scroll, spread it, and destroy the authority it had held for centuries. With sunlight climbing toward dawn through heavy drapes, I placed the urn, the scroll, the artifacts, the ledger, every last fragment of their oppression into a box marked memories to share that I would take to church, to registrar, to library, to press. And in that moment, I felt Rowan Manor itself inhale justice for the first time. The pact was no longer quiet. It now spoke, through public memory, through breaking silence, through every name read aloud. It had ended with me, but would begin again, becoming a tale of rebirth, not removal. I returned to Rowan Manor on the cusp of evening, the sky painted in watercolors as though the world itself exhaled in relief, and I walked across the orchard's grass, now lush where it had once been overgrown, a deliberate act of renewal that contrasted with every act of erasure the house had endured. Each step rustled through the names embroidered on wooden stakes I had planted earlier that day, each bearing the name of a Rowan daughter erased. And Charlotte, Dorothy, Elizabeth, Eleanor, Mary, Rebecca, Jessamine, Harriet, names I whispered quietly as I kneaded soil over each stake, sealing not just their markers but the promise of remembrance in a land where their gifts had been buried, their voices faded, their presence uncatalogued. The sun dipped lower, and the orchard's ancient apple trees, planted by sons of generations past, now witnessed a new ritual reckoning. I carried Jessamine's doll, still missing her arm, and placed it beneath a low branch, draping a soft shawl embroidered with all 9 names over the limb. Sunlight catching on glass eyes and tresses tangled in the grass, offering visible restitution for intangible harm. I lit small candles in glass jars at the foot of every stake, their flames flickering in time with a light breeze, and as dusk deepened I recited aloud, voice steady with grief and resolution. And Rowan, you must have been brave to map moonlight, to draw maps to freedom, and may your footsteps find the roads you never traveled. Charlotte Rowan, may the lullabies you tried to mail be sung today, by voices that remember. Dorothy Rowan. May the badge you wore to school shine now under candlelight. Honor for your courage. Elizabeth Rowan. May your sketches breathe on canvas in a world that sees you. Eleanor Rowan. May the stories you wrote live in open books, not hidden in cedar chests. Mary Rowan. May your ashes feed no silence, but blossom into testimony. Rebecca Rowan. May your name be spoken more than it was struck. Jessamine Rowan. May your doll hold her missing arm as though whole again. Harriet Rowan. May your final gown be unfurled, seen, loved, remembered. As each name left my lips, the orchard's bird stilled, and for a moment I sensed a hollow hush of the past shift beneath the trees, an affirmation, a receiving of voice. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Margaret and Andrew emerged from the manor, older, frielier, carrying the and artifacts I'd asked them to bring, each step slow but purposeful as though atonement willed their bones forward. We stood together in that circle of light and stakes and candles, 3 generations bridged by truth and grief, taking a breath that carried centuries of erased songs, bridging dusk and dawn, silence and speech. Margaret's voice, tremulous and small, broke the hush. "Aye," she said, tears reflecting candlelight. "I thought I could trade their lives for safety. I was wrong." Andrew nodded, his hand on her shoulder. "We built cages. You opened them." We all watched as she knelt to tend the soil of Elizabeth's stake, running fingers through the earth as though coaxing life, and I saw in her motion regret, but also resolve. I placed the urn of Mary beside her stake, picked up Charlotte's doll and replaced it gently near Jessamine's name, and together we arranged fresh blooms beside each candle. White lilies for innocence, wildflowers for resilience. We closed eyes to pray for their souls, their beginnings cut short, their stories beginning anew here. And against the quiet hum of insects and distant farm sounds, I whispered the final line, "You belong here, now, always." As the twilight deepened into night, Mrs. Graves appeared at the edge of the orchard, bringing a small lantern house. She'd repurposed to guide the candles upward. She placed it on a low stone bench, lit its wick, and nodded at me, a silent pact. All witnesses matter. We stood together, blood, neighbor blood, witness blood, creating a circle of memory illuminated not by monument, but by living presence. Then came the moment I had dreaded but prepared for. I asked Margaret and Andrew to speak each daughter's name aloud. Their voices shook, but each name passed through them like a salve. And Charlotte, Dorothy, Elizabeth, Eleanor, Mary, Rebecca, Jessamine, Harriet. As they spoke, I saw the orchard tree's shadow stretch, not to hide, but to shelter, a reversal of every erasure done here. When names were done, I gathered my instruments, the scroll of the pact, the ledger photographs, the journal entries, Charlotte's diary, the greenhouse letter, all proof bound together. I burned each name tag in a lantern of memory, a quiet flame to seal their acknowledgement into air and soil. I watched them burn in dispersing ash onto the grass, mingling with candle soot and earth, a symbolic return of their spirits to the land they should have inhabited. As smoke curled upward, the manor's windows glowed in the distance, and I felt a pulse of energy, recognition, relief, rebirth, flow through every tree root beneath my knees. The pact was broken. The daughters had spoken. A kaleidoscope of histories, wrongs, griefs, truths, and now this, a circle of remembrance planted in ground that once only swallowed secrets. We linger a moment, not speaking, drinking in what history might forgive, what memory might grant passage. When dawn edged gold across the horizon, we left the orchard as a family transformed, no longer bound by erasure, but bound by remembrance. I knew my next steps: register the names publicly, petition for historical recognition at the town hall, start a scholarship in their honor, write the final chapter of their story for the community, for future daughters. And as I drove away from Rowan Manor, leaving behind the orchard gently guarded by names spoken aloud, I felt a serenity I'd not known before. The house, too, seemed quieter, but in that quiet lay truth, not deprivation, not absence, but redemption, presence, and a legacy reborn as courageous memory, one rooted in soil, sustained by voice, and destined to grow in every daughter's morning birth cry to come.